Hello everyone, JesterGio here, and welcome back to Brewing Thoughts. In today's video, we're gonna be talking about all the balance changes that will be coming out for the end of Season 33. These changes will greatly impact a lot of the survivors who will be getting changes in a positive ways, while the negatives will sting, but not by much. Before we do cover these changes, however, there's two things that I wanted to mention. First, while Forward and Toy Merchant are confirmed to be getting buffs, they will not be included in this cycle of balance changes. Violetta also isn't included, however that's because her adjustment is nothing more than optimization. Fortunately, Mechanic will be getting changed this season and she is actually getting a decent adjustment. This leads into my second point. While there are a lot of adjustments made that I personally really like, there are also a lot of adjustments made to the characters that I don't like. The reason for why I like and dislike certain changes varies on the character and other factors, so that'll determine who I talk about first in this video. I will go over all the changes I personally love first before slowly working my way down to the changes I'm personally not a fan of. And for an extra final note, just know that I still won't cover the recent nerfs they made to Goatman. In my opinion, these nerfs won't impact Goatman as much as people say they will, and they ended up nerfing the wrong aspects of his kit anyways, so I'm not gonna bother talking about them. Anyways, with that out of the way, we can finally start talking about the balance changes. To start things off, let's talk about the character I'm most looking forward to her changes, the Faro Lady adjustments. For those of you who don't know, Faro Lady is a character I have criticized in the past because of how lackluster her kit is. While they did improve it and she's now far better than she was in her test server, she still wasn't a good character on release. My biggest complaint by far being her invisibility. Since you were given no control on when you gain and lost it, you gave yourself away more often than not. And the ability was far too punishing to be considered worth it. There are just too many abilities in this game that can counter you and too many aspects that can give yourself away that I just felt this ability wasn't good. Additionally, her cane ability was just so bad. My only advice was to hold on to it because Cypher Rush is important, otherwise just grab a chest item. Faro Lady is a character with additional problems, such as her rescue debuff being bad and her decoding being subpar for a decoder. But I feel like those can be made up if her ability was at least good. However, with all the limiting factors behind all of it and how punishing it is, I just felt like Faro Lady isn't a good decoder who needed more tweaks to be worth using. Fortunately, and I'm extremely happy to say this, I feel like the recent buff they gave to Faro Lady fixed every problem I had with invisibility and shot her up from playable to worthy on a team. They still haven't given you the ability to choose when you use it like Gardener, but the alternative they did makes up for it. You see, the problem I had with invisibility was the amount of ways you can lose it and how punishing it can be to lose it. Whether it be interacting at the threshold, flywheeling, using items, or being hit by a hunter ability of any kind, there are just too many ways you can lose your ability, and no matter how you lost it, it will always be placed on that same 40-second cooldown. It doesn't matter if you lost your ability at the end of your power or at the beginning, you still had to suffer those 40 seconds, and that's what made Faro Lady feel so bad to play. With the new buff, they address this issue by making her cooldown scale depending on her cloak meter. From 0% to 100%, Faro Lady's cooldown will scale depending on when her invisibility ends, and it goes from 3 seconds to the standard 40 seconds. This means that if you lose the invisibility via that 40% threshold, your cooldown goes down from 40 seconds to 18 seconds. This is a massive buff to Faro Lady, as she now has something that she has never had in past iterations with her ability, Control. While you don't have complete control over your ability, you still have more control on when it ends and when it starts up because of this buff. This buff also makes losing your ability at the 40% threshold or earlier far more worth it because you will gain it back much sooner than if you were to let it run out completely. This also makes it so items and flywheel have much more synergy with her than ever before, as using them will not punish you as heavily. In fact, the main reason why I was against using flywheel on her is because it removed invisibility early and put it on that 40-second cooldown. There are so many possibilities that have now opened up because of this change that I believe this is the biggest change they have ever made to Faro Lady. And do you wanna know the craziest part? The fun doesn't end here. On top of them fixing her cloak cooldown to scale with percents, they also fixed another major problem I had with her cloak ability, that being her audio and visual cues. One of the biggest problems with invisibility other than the cooldown was just how easy it was to track Faro Lady while invisible. Not only does Faro Lady's footsteps still appear whenever she runs while invisible, but she lets out a lot of loud breathing that makes tracking her so much easier. On top of that, your main item is almost worthless most of the time because, unless used out of sight and out of earshot, the hunter can see when you fake a trail and make a guess because of it. It made it so hunters can very easily find and hit Faro Lady out of invisibility, making the invisibility even more useless than other characters with invisibility, such as Magician or First Officer. Now, this has completely changed due to two changes they made to audio. First, they made it so Faro Lady's movement sounds are silent anytime she is invisible. This means you won't be able to hear Faro Lady as hunter while she is invisible. From watching the video, she still makes loud breathing sounds, which can give away your position even after this change. That being said, this can be countered by holding your cane, thus completely muting Faro Lady. On top of these changes, they also remove the sound and visual cue cane makes whenever you fake a trail using it, which, thank God they did it. Seriously, the fact that it took them this long to do this change is just puzzling. The cane often ended up being useless because you couldn't use it in the open or else the hunter can just choose a trail and whether they guess right or not is up to luck. Additionally, certain hunters, like Ripper, can just throw or shoot an ability in the direction of one of the trails and completely ignore this 50-50 aspect. Because of this, on top of the cane having only two uses, I felt the cane was very lacking and was probably the worst item in the game. When it works, you can buy so much time and gain so much distance for your team. However, it can also not work and would end up being useless because of it. Now, cane has went from a useless item to an incredibly useful item, as you can do so much more with the mind game aspect with the cane and not be at risk of dying because of it. These two changes dramatically buff Faro Lady's kiting aspects, as they allow Faro Lady to mind game more effectively and, because of that, increases her survivability tenfold. That said, I do feel like they kinda overdid the mind game aspect of her buff a little bit. Other than that complaint, I really love these changes made to Faro Lady, as they address all of the complaints I had that made her feel lackluster. With these changes, I do think that Faro Lady has went from a throw pick to a genuinely good pick to have on your team, especially in this current meta. I still don't think she'll ever stand on the same level as Prisoner or Lawyer due to her more lackluster decoding and her abysmal rescue debuff. However, I do think these changes will make her an extremely good kiter who can track ciphers for the team and do a bit of burst decoding, so overall, good changes. The next character is Mechanic and, while she didn't get any major changes, I extremely love the direction they went with this change. First, they reduced the decoding debuff Cowardly grants from 35% to 25%. This means, with Mech Master, you will be decoding 15% slower when one person is injured and 40% slower when two people are injured. To compensate a little bit, Bot got a few tweaks of its own as well. Now, Bot's decoding speed got further decreased from 10% to 16%, however its duration was increased from 0.56% to 0.5% and 0.83% to 0.75% when using Bot on chair. While not as big as the Faro Lady changes, I still think these are extremely good changes, as they address the main complaint with Mechanic. Mechanic is a character who is extremely useful when she has Bot, who can use it as a fit survivor in the match to decode, heal, rescue, or open gates. However, without Bot, Mechanic essentially becomes one of the worst survivors in this game, as her decoding debuff makes her a detriment to the team. Oftentimes, there will always be one person injured in a match, meaning Mechanic will always consistently have her decoding debuff dealt onto her. Combine that with the fact that the meta hunters excel at map traversal and talents such as Panic, it can make Mechanic an extremely crippling survivor to have on the team. I've had matches and seen matches where the match falls apart near the end game because there just wasn't enough ciphers completed thanks to Mechanic's debuffs. With this buff, Mechanic will go from decoding on par with a Merc with one person injured to decoding on par with Gravekeeper, a much better improvement. Mechanic will still be a risky survivor to play and your decoding debuff will become abysmal when two people are injured, however you will not be put in as bad of a losing position anymore. As for the bot changes, I do think these are really good changes as well. The duration changes don't really help in decoding with mech, as you only really have 20 more seconds of bot life left after 2 ciphers. That being said, what this will help with is bot's utility to be that fifth survivor, possibly making rescues, extra heals, or even make it to gate to prep opening when old bot couldn't. The decoding nerf also seemed to have been in place in order to encourage that playstyle, which I feel is a healthier way to change bot. Overall, while these changes won't make mech meta as she's an extremely outdated character in the meta, these will definitely help make mech feel a lot better to play, so good changes all around. Finally, we have the Axe Boy changes, who got some good adjustments as well. First, they increased the amount of peaceful pines that can be placed on the map from 5 to 6. This is an extremely minor buff to his kit, but can really help you in a pinch. Whether it be placing more trees the survivors are forced to break or allows a tree to stay up after planting one more tree, this buff can be really helpful in your matches. Additionally, it makes it so you have a total of 9 trees at the start of the match rather than 8, so it's a decent change. Next, they increased the width of the Restful Road by 50%, which is a massive buff to Restful Road. It allows you to play around with Restful Road a bit more without worrying about falling off and losing your speed. It'll also make carrying survivors on the road much easier as well, as the width will help keep you in the road while they struggle. It's another small change like the tree buff, but the small amount of extra utility added will definitely be impactful in your Axe Boy matches. However, I think the biggest change to come from these buffs has to be the optimization they are making to purple souls. Basically, they are optimizing the position of the resentful souls that follow around survivors to prevent Axe Boy from selecting the wrong soul to pull. Having been a past Axe Boy main myself, I know how much it sucked to chase after a survivor with 2 resentful souls following them around. When at an angle or to the side of a survivor, it can be fine to use resentful souls as is. However, the souls would usually overlap with one another and, because of this, you'll more often pull the soul that's behind the survivor rather than the one in front of them. It makes situations where there are 2 souls following the survivors extremely frustrating, as you need to be extra careful or else you'll mess up the shot. With this change, it seems like the soul you highlight will stay the soul you will drag, no matter if another soul overlaps with you. This makes it extremely good when chasing a survivor with 2 purple souls, as it prevents you from taking the wrong soul and wasting your ability. Additionally, this also works on souls in the tree areas, so this will also help you select which soul you need more smoothly. Overall, these are some great Axe Boy buffs that will make him feel so much better to play as a character. Now that we got all the changes I'm most excited for out of the way, let's go over the changes I'm neutral or don't really care about. This section won't take as long as these are reserved for minor changes. First is Weeping Clown, who I am happy for the adjustment he got, but not for the same reasons I did for the other 3 changes. Weeping Clown got his decoding nerfed, going from a 10% debuff to a 15% decoding debuff. This means he completes ciphers in 95.29 seconds rather than 90 seconds, the same amount of time as Gravekeeper. However, when factoring in perfect calibrations, this number can go to 91.29 seconds, so about the same as the normal debuff. I'm sure this begs the question, why am I even happy Weeping Clown got nerfed in the first place? The answer being I'm less so happy they nerfed him in the first place, but more so happy what they didn't nerfed. There's been a lot of talk about nerfing Weeping Clown because of how strong his rocket has been, which made me scared they would nerf rocket. Despite this, a lot of people including myself agree that Weeping Clown doesn't really need a nerf because his performance depends on the player rather than the character. He's a character who can perform well in the right hands, but can also be easily countered by the hunter player if they use their tools to their advantage. Additionally, while Weeping Clown can be a scary survivor to face in the early game for most hunters, once the hunter gains presence, their presence ability is usually enough to help them deal with Weeping Clown. Finally, while Weeping Clown can do well against hunters like Opera or YIIK, he is by no means a priority pick, as he gets hard countered by other hunters like Ivy, Goatman, or even Alva. Because of this, I'm happy they touched his decoding speed rather than his rocket, as I feel nerfing rocket will only send him into irrelevancy yet again. I don't care about this nerf because it won't hurt him drastically, but it's because I don't care that I'm happy with this nerf. Moving on to Geisha, she got a light slap on the wrist herself, as her cooldown for dash got increased from 8 seconds to 9 seconds. Geisha falls into Weeping Clown's group where her dash logic being optimized definitely helped her become really good to play, however she still wasn't strong enough to warrant a nerf. Geisha is definitely more annoying to face against now with the dash optimizations, but I wouldn't call her a scary hunter to face off against or deserving of nerfs. Personally, I don't think this change will hurt Geisha players all that much and will only serve to lower the ban rates for Geisha just a little bit more. Finally, we have Prospector, who while I don't care about, I'm a bit mixed on his nerf. Prospector got a recharge rate nerf to his magnets yet again, making his magnetic recharge go from 60 seconds to 70 seconds. Now, I'm sorta mixed on it because I do understand why people would be upset about this change. Prospector is another character who you could argue doesn't deserve a nerf because he already had so much nerfed in his kit from his previous nerf. Prospector is a character who does tend to leave and re-enter the meta constantly, unlike other meta characters, who have perfectly cemented themselves in the meta. He is a strong character, but not oppressive enough to warrant a nerf, which is why I understand why people are upset. However, I don't really care about this nerf as well because I can kinda understand why NetEase is specifically nerfing his recharge. I am not gonna sugarcoat it, even after the nerfs, Prospector still remains as one of the most item spammy survivors in this game. This is a problem a lot of recharge survivors suffer from, as they don't have to worry about using their item up, as they can get it back eventually. Because of this, their players tend to just spam their items whenever they're in danger more often than characters with a limited resource, which can often be very annoying. It especially becomes annoying with Prospector, as he's a harasser character who can use his item for containment, alongside being extremely popular in the player base. With the recharge nerf, it's aiming to make Prospector players play a bit more carefully with their magnets and not throw them away like candy, since they recharge much slower now. It also makes it easier for the hunters he counters, as they have to worry about less magnets now. If you were to ask me if they should have nerfed Prospector, I would have said no, as he's fine the way he is, but the nerf they did, I get the reason why, so I don't really care. Finally, we have 2 changes left to cover, and these are the changes that I'm not really a fan of. These changes vary heavily from each other on why I dislike them, so let's actually talk about those changes, shall we? Starting with the Nightmare changes, Nightmare got a few stat buffs to boot. For starters, his camera angle when moving will be optimized. This will just make Nightmare feel a bit nicer to play, but since we don't know the actual logistics of it, that's really all I can say. Next, they buffed his pallet breaking speed yet again, making his chase feel a bit better now. They also buffed Poaching's movement speed buff whenever out of pursuit from 10% and 13% and made it so it degrades to 0 when you enter into a chase rather than removes it immediately. This makes Nightmare's map traversal without Raven feel a bit better and allows you to use Poaching in chase a bit better than you would before this buff. Now, I'm sure you're looking at these changes and are thinking these aren't such bad changes and are wondering why I have a problem with his overall buffs. Well, the problems start to begin when we get into the final 2 changes they made to Nightmare. Starting with his nerf, they nerfed the cooldown of Bad Omen from 50 seconds to 57 seconds. This change greatly weakens his teleport and, by proxy, weakens his mid to end game potential. This is extremely bad, as his end game was really the only thing that was keeping Nightmare from being the worst hunter in the game other than poaching, as his kit is just extremely weak. This becomes especially bad at the end game when the gates are powered, as Raven doesn't nerf survivors' gate opening speed and survivors now have 7 free seconds to decode the gate. This could absolutely be the difference between survivors opening the gate or you teleporting in time, so this is a really bad change all around. To compensate for this, they gave Nightmare a new passive ability to buff his chase called Relevation. If you are hit by a pallet while using your dash, the next time you dash into a drop pallet, you will not be stunned or knocked back and the pallet will be automatically broken. This is meant to help against pallet camping, as most survivors will just camp behind the pallet until you dash into it and then stun you. On paper, this buff seems really good and easily makes up for the teleport nerf they gave to Nightmare. However, the more I thought about it, the more I realized just how unimpressive this ability actually is. While pallet camping is a good way to deal with Nightmare, another effective way to deal with Nightmare is to just pre-drop the pallet. This already invalidates Revelation, as Nightmare is forced to just kick every pallet he comes across rather than use his passive to get free hits off pallet stuns. This is made even worse by the fact that certain kiting areas have bumpy terrain for Nightmare to get stuck on and whatnot, allowing you to safely pre-drop the pallet after the dash. Additionally, survivors already have a ton of abilities to help them delay the first hit, such as tank abilities or stuns, and this ability doesn't really help with that. To top it all off, you can't even ambush other survivors in the match with Revelation because the game tells the team if a player pallet stuns the hunter. This will put all players on high alert, knowing not to go for stuns anymore after the first pallet stun is to not give him any free hits. That isn't to say that Revelation is entirely bad or useless, it can definitely come in clutch where the survivor is forced to drop the pallet. But you are at the perfect distance to reach the pallet with dash. And it makes weaker pallet areas much stronger for Nightmare, as his ability allows him to play around it very easily. However, do I think this alongside the other buffs are enough to outweigh the devastating teleport nerf he got? Absolutely not. If this ability worked like a mini excitement you needed to get stunned to get, I can easily see this making up for the teleport nerf as survivor stuns tend to hurt Nightmare more than pallet stuns. Sadly, that is not the case and Nightmare ended up getting the Leo treatment where he got a few small buffs for a giant nerf. That being said, while I don't really like how they went about adjusting Nightmare, I would be lying if I said I hated this change. No, that pales in comparison to what they did with the Puppeteer buff. First off, why are we even buffing Puppeteer in the first place? Puppeteer has already proven himself to being an extremely good character in the meta right now, so much so that he is both picked and banned very often in tournament. Buffing him feels very weird because he has already proven himself to be a staple in this current day meta. So with that in mind, why are we even buffing Puppeteer in the first place? It makes absolutely no sense to do and it is just as baffling as when they nerfed Professor. Sorry, I just needed to get that out of my system. Now we can go on to the actual buffs themselves. For starters, they reduced the healing debuff he gives to survivors whenever he fully heals them. Now, instead of that survivor getting healed 20% slower, they will be healed 10% slower. This was what a lot of people felt the Puppeteer buff was gonna be, and, if this was it, I wouldn't have too much of a problem with the buff. It doesn't affect his initial healing speed towards others, so he still has some drawbacks when healing other survivors. However, it does make other players healing that same survivor more manageable, as they don't suffer from the giant debuff. In the end, it's a harmless buff and I would not really care about this if this was the only thing they changed. However, it's the next two changes that really makes me dislike this buff. They made Alva hits work differently when he hits Lewis, as now Lewis will tank all the hits he can before the rest of the damage is spread throughout the connected team. So, for example, if Lewis and another survivor are connected together and Alva lands a hit on Lewis, because Alva does 1.2 damage. Lewis will tank the 1 damage hits before the 0.2 damage gets spread between Matthias and that teammate. This makes Puppeteer a stronger counter to Alva, as he can reduce the amount of damage the team takes, thus allowing him to protect his team and allow them to conserve health states. This is a really good change, giving Puppeteer a bit more versatility against the Alva matchup. Is what I would say if I wasn't a fucking liar who was holding out on information on you. What if I were to tell you that instead of Lewis mitigating the amount of damage he gives to the team, he can just absorb all the damage and leave the team unharmed? How? Well, this is due to his final buff they did, which increased Lewis's health from 1.0 damage to 1.5 damage. This means Lewis can tank the equivalent of one Joseph normal hit or a normal hit and a chip hit and be perfectly fine. It's only when you take damage greater than 1.5 damage that will cause damage overflow to happen. If I had one video that perfectly summarized my feelings on this change, it's this one.
What the fuck were they thinking?
No, seriously, what the fuck were they thinking with this change? This single change completely changes every single interaction Puppeteer has with not only the game mechanics but also his counterplay. To rip the band-aid off, a lot of the hunters who used to counter him before will now have a much harder time going against Puppeteer now. Characters like Gamekeeper, Joseph, and Alva will have no answers to deal with Lewis and will suffer greatly because of it. Not only that, but other hunters like Bonbon and Sculptor will be forced to use a lot more resources now in order to properly deal with Lewis. This is made extra harder by the fact that Puppeteer gains a 8% speed boost each time he turns into Lewis. This can make landing your chip hits far harder to do, thus wasting even more resources. It's either that or just waiting out the 8 seconds, which can add up to 24 seconds given you wait out all 3 Lewis out. Stun hunters also won't be as effective now since Puppeteer can turn into Lewis as soon as he is about to get stunned or use Undaunted to prevent the stun. You could see the double hit method being a good way to force damage overflow and down him quickly. But the problem is that Puppeteer typically won't end Lewis in the open and will use it to reach pallet areas to kite out the time. This will further help Puppeteer conserve his health states, allowing him to use Lewis more and waste even more time. Lewis practically counters most, if not all, of the hunters in this current meta, making him an extremely versatile survivor to use against any hunter in this game. On top of that, how his damage offset works now greatly changes how he can use Lewis in any given situation. Before the buff, if Lewis gets terror shocked while at full health, Puppeteer would not be able to access him anymore because he wouldn't have enough health to change into Lewis. Now, Lewis will be able to tank a terror shock and Puppeteer will still be able to turn into Lewis once more because the new damage limit will only allow him to take 0.5 damage instead of 1 damage. He can also use Lewis to tank 1 detention hit at full health and still use Lewis again for the extra 8% speed and Undaunted to buy time for his team to open the gates. This also means a chip Puppeteer will not go down to terror shocks or detention hits whenever he uses Lewis, which is huge. He can buy a bit more time against Balloon with 3 spikes now, as he can now survive off of 0.5 health instead of dying. Rescuing as Puppeteer is far easier now, since you can tank a normal terror shock and still be able to use Lewis later on. There are so many doors that open up because of this one change that I have to ask again, did Puppeteer really need this buff? As of writing this, it is currently the 17th of September and the end of the season ends next week. This means that if there are no last-second changes made to the test server, this is the Puppeteer that will be coming to the game. I seriously hope netties will understand that this is a bad idea and go back to change Puppeteer, but it's not looking to be the case, sadly. With that said, that about covers all my thoughts on the balance changes for the end of Season 33. Overall, other than both the Nightmare and the Puppeteer changes coming up, I do think this has been an amazing balance patch that will definitely make the game feel fun for certain characters. The nerfs also didn't hit as hard this season as other seasons, which is great since the characters in this patch didn't need heavy nerfs. While most of the changes weren't too much to talk about, there are still a lot of changes here that can change a few character tiers. All in all, this has been a really good balance cycle and I can't wait to try out all the changes going into Season 34. By the time this video comes out, the changes probably would have already been added to the game, so I hope you have fun with that. With all that said, thank you so much for watching and I will see all of you next time.